Hi everybody. Sorry, I'm having a few challenges with Zoom today, so I am going to be recording this lecture and posting it for you to view on your own time. So this week we're delving into Chapter 2, and this is the history of drug use as it relates to legislation. Now, something that we have to understand is that, like almost every other public health problem or concern, that we are dealing with legislative needs or legislative expectations, or in reality, politics, if we're trying to deal with any public health need. So the next couple of slides are dealing with our objectives for this chapter. One of the things that we all bring with us is our own personal biases and life experiences that shape or influence our views about this topic. And like we talked about last week, our author of our textbook has some very specific biases and views as well. Not to say that anybody's ideas are right or wrong, but just that they're their own ideas and opinions. And one of the beautiful things about this class is we want you to take the time and to feel encouraged to share your own ideas and develop your own ideas and learn what other people have to say as you shape what you want to believe and what you want to do going forward. So we're going to look at some of the historical things that have brought about changes related to drug policy, and one of the big ones, of course, being prohibition. Prohibition was a big deal. It happened in the early portion of the 20th century, and it was something that was enacted at a federal level, and we actually created an amendment to the Constitution. So we're going to spend some time talking about prohibition this week. But there are other things that were important in historical accounts of how our community and societies have dealt with the drug problems. An important takeaway is it's not just the damage that drugs do to individuals or society that might impact how a community or legislative policy deals with drug problems. In fact, the support for a ban on opiates was not even a result of domestic problems in the United States. It was actually related to international issues, and that's what caused changes to U.S. policy. So as we try to understand all the multiple forces that are at work that encourage changes in regulation, laws, and policy related to drugs, these are some of the important things for us to consider. Something that cannot be understated is the role of the culture and the media on influencing what happens in society or culture. And so these things that are changing in local society and then the things that are associated with those changes are oftentimes the impetus to create legislative changes. One of the big things right now, for example, is the level of cartels or international crime involved in the drug trade. And that has a lot to do with how policy and legislation is going to be enacted to deal with that problem. Another important thing to consider is the legalization of some previously controlled substances and how that has impacted drug use or abuse in society, whether it's been positive or negative. But we're going to learn why the Food and Drug Administration launched such widespread anti-amphetamine campaigns going on in the 1960s. And the 1960s is an important time to think about what changed in the culture and how drug culture influenced the greater culture at large, and what were some of those things that made drugs so prevalent in the 1960s. Were there historical things going on? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. We had the Vietnam War and a lot of disillusionment, especially of youth that were maybe sent somewhere else to serve, or disillusionment with government, or disillusionment with different characteristics of life that encouraged drug use. A lot of historical and regulatory things related to drug use and abuse are now focused on how to treat drug addiction, and the focus originally was on a behavioral problem, and drug use was considered a behavioral problem. Now, from the more pharmacological ideas related to drug dependence and how chemical dependence can occur, that it's looked at as a more scientific addiction is more of a medical issue than a behavioral issue. It really is both, and you can't really divorce the two concepts from each other, but the models of how we treat it, depending upon how we look at it, might change, and it can help maybe eliminate some of the stigma when we focus more on treating it from a medical point of view than associating cultural values to it. So politics is always downstream of culture. And what that means is things that are changing in culture, eventually those things are also going to be changed in politics and legislation and laws. And so what we typically see is the pendulum swings one way and will get very stringent in one direction, but then as time goes by, it will swing back to the other side. And so, we really have a drug epidemic right now, and it would be interesting to see what policy changes are going to occur as a result of the different drug problems that we have in society right now. But enacting drug policy takes time. You have to do community organization. You have to get people in politics behind the idea to change. And then you actually have to go through the political process to get laws changed. So policy decisions are oftentimes based on cultural decisions. It's the culture that is going to push legislatures in a direction to enact policy that's going to change these epidemic problems. A lot of times drug policy is biased, and we have to take that into consideration, that popular prejudices against different groups may fuel drug policy, and we really need to be more scientific than that, and we really need to look at evidence and levels of evidence to make decisions about drug policy. We have to think about disproportionate impact and how some people are bearing larger burdens, or some groups are bearing larger burdens associated with drug policy than others, and really think at trying to improve overall population health rather than just be focused on deterring drug use. So as we start to talk about drug policy, one of the best things for us to look at is alcohol, because alcohol has been around so long. People have known how to make alcohol for a very long time, and the uses of drinking alcohol for recreational purposes have been around for almost as long as history itself. Citizens of the United States, we consume large quantities of alcohol. The first temperance society, so temperance is actually a term related to not drinking. So temperance is a group of people that are interested in not having alcohol be a part of your life. That's a temperance society. The first one in the United States was founded in 1808, and opposition to alcohol was often intertwined with what they call nativism. Efforts against alcohol and other psychoactive drugs were often thinly veiled reactions to minority groups. Because some cultures engaged in using different substances as part of their culture. And so people from different groups might be very ethnocentric or xenophobic, and because their culture doesn't value the use of those substances, that they were basically prejudiced against people from that culture because of, in particular, maybe the use of imbibing in different psychoactive substances. Now today we understand that there are a variety of different cultures that employ different traditional practices that may or may not be good, or may not be bad. And we look at things, or we try to look at things through a more objective lens. But again, we really need to think about, a lot of our views about drug use and drug policy, and make sure that we are not inappropriately prejudiced or biased against certain groups. So going back to prohibition. Prohibition resulted in an amendment to the United States Constitution, making the sale or manufacture of alcohol illegal. In 1920, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act and strengthened the language of that amendment that was passed in 1919. and it defined what an intoxicating beverage was. So something that had more than 0.5% alcohol would be considered intoxicating. When you think about alcohol from beer is about somewhere between 4 and 7% in most cases. So it didn't take a lot of alcohol. But even simple things like spice extracts and kombuchas and things that were naturally fermented and stored as a means of preserving food would get a certain amount of alcohol content to them as they were preserved over time, that was a pretty stringent standard at 0.5%. But the National Prohibition Movement provided federal law enforcement activities for the enforcement of prohibition, and the United States Treasury called that prohibition group the Prohibition Bureau. And it turned into a money-making opportunity all on its own. The Prohibition Bureau ended up with a reputation for being corrupt. And I'm sure there were probably people that were a part of it that were not, but usually it's the worst people within a group that somehow make a group get defined by those worst people. But by 1930, there were 86 different federal agents and 200 civilians that had been killed as a result of actions of the Prohibition Bureau. And the murder rate in the United States had gone from 6.8% in 1920 to 9.7% in 1933, and this was the year that prohibition was repealed. So we saw as soon as prohibition got repealed and alcohol was again legalized that the death, and murder rate went up. So we definitely can associate, like we talked about last week, the increase of availability of drugs to the increase in crime and violence. But prohibition was looked at as a great experiment, and it provided us an opportunity to see what would happen when we outlawed certain substances, and then what we could predict would happen when we made those substances legal. And that comes back to the discussion about marijuana or other drugs and the legalization of other drugs. And while the amount of money that might be collected in taxes is one financial consideration, the devastation associated with family members who are strung out, or the devastation associated with the increased medical costs or the increases in crime are really something that need to be factored in as we consider whether or not certain substances should be legal. So as you read in your can't speak. So as you read in your assigned reading for this week in Chapter 2 about prohibition, could you think of something similar today? Like we've had a war on drugs going back since, I believe, the Bush era. And so that's been going on for a long time. We've spent a lot of money in the war on drugs, but it doesn't seem like the drug epidemic is getting much better. In fact, it might even be argued that the drug epidemic is getting worse. So we are fighting a losing battle, I would say, in the war on drugs. Do you think if we tried to prohibit alcohol today, that we would have a similar situation to what prohibition did before? What do you think would happen, since there are certain substances that are currently criminalized, if we legalize those substances over the next 20 years? A lot of people have different ideas, and a lot of people are saying, you can't close Pandora's box once you open it. But there's a lot of movement in political spheres and cultural spheres to decriminalize illegal substances. And depending upon who you talk to, this could be a very good idea or a very bad idea. Wonder what your thoughts are. We'll be exploring that in some of our discussion questions. So opium is derived from the gum or the sap that comes off of a seed pod of a specific type of poppy called the opium poppy. It is considered a depressant and a pain reliever, right? This was a test question that you could use on your practice quiz. But 2 centuries ago, opium was generally available as a cure for pretty much everything. They put it in toothache medication and cough syrups. Pretty much everything you could think of had some form of what was then called laudanum. By the end of the 18th century, a pharmacist decided to pour some ammonia over opium to create an alkaloid, and that substance was dubbed the name morphium, named after the Greek god of sleep and dreams, Morpheus. But scientific journals in the early 1800s popularized the new morphine drug, resulting in a widespread use of it by doctors who viewed opium without having negative side effects. It wasn't until later that they learned the negative side effects associated with opium. But if they'd have done a little research and a little bit of study and understanding the problems with laudanum, they might have been able to predict that the widespread use of opium was going to cause some problems. Morphine and heroin, and even today fentanyl, are all similar derivatives of the same type of drug. Fentanyl being a very inexpensive formation of a synthetic form of a morphine. But by the 1850s, we had widespread availability of morphine without a prescription. People were injecting morphine. People were using morphine for pain control. And morphine in 1874 was synthesized into the drug known today as heroin. Chinese laborers or immigrants from China who came to work in the United States in a variety of industries, not just in the gold fields, but in the railroad and other building trades, brought in the habit of smoking opium. And so this was introduced widely in the late 1870s. There was a huge economic depression in California, and when people are depressed, they look for ways to deal with their depression. The reality, though, being that morphine actually can make you depressed even more. Depressed economic conditions and xenophobia led to one Western state after another enacting anti-Chinese legislation that included the prohibition of smoking opium. And this was maybe not fair because we were talking about the cultural impact of smoking opium in communities, but the use of opium by the Chinese immigrants may have not even been a problem, but it had to be blamed on somebody. And so xenophobia is, really disliking another cultural group based on a characteristic that just makes them different, and having a fear of those differences, maybe not understanding their culture, and then assigning blame in that area. So by 1914, the Harrison Act was passed. So this was a legal, basically a law, policy that was acted into law in which people that were going to be selling or distributing morphine or morphine products needed to register with the government and pay an annual tax of $1. And this was more to create a registry of who would be giving out these derivatives, and it was associated with over 200 medical professionals that registered. The Internal Revenue Service was placed in charge of upholding the Harrison Act, and it was at this time that we realized that maybe we needed to think of having different regulatory agencies involved. Because I got my cameo there. So even today, we do have a heroin market. Lots of different subpopulations or subcultures are more predisposed to heroin use. And again, a lot of drug use is associated with availability of drugs. So if cartels or urban dealers or different areas have more access, or different populations have more access, again, access is going to drive usage. So having access to a drug puts it at higher risk for being abused. So cocaine is a different class of drug. It's not a depressant, it's a stimulant, and it's found in significant quantities in a special leaf from a special plant called the coca shrub or a coca leaf. These are prevalent in South America. They're indigenous plants. And again, the coca leaf had been used by indigenous peoples in that area for thousands and thousands of years, and it was part of the culture. Cocaine became popular in Europe in the 19th century as the leaf was chewed The simple chewing of the simple leaf provided increased stamina and energy, similar to like drinking coffee. But after the turn of the 20th century, the urban underworld kind of changed the whole use of cocaine, and cocaine became purified and concentrated, and then it was abused. And so there are certain geographic locations that were higher concentrations of where cocaine was abused, but it is widely popular across a variety of cultures and subcultures in the United States and has been so since about the 1920s. For short periods of time in society, cocaine use has waxed and waned, just depending upon other influxes of what is popular in the culture at the time. But cocaine has been a significant problem in its many different forms. Cocaine can be smoked or injected and has different street names based upon the quality of the cocaine and the concentration of it, but it is still widely used and abused. Crack is one of those manifestations or preparations of cocaine in a newer form. The general public had less tolerance as the 1980s approached, and users and sellers became younger, and those that were involved with heroin might have needed to have access to something different as availability was more challenging. And so crack was much more popular in the 80s and even to today. But again, as new drugs come on the scene, the popularity of any given drug is going to wax and wane. Because the impact of crack made such big and scary changes and was on the news and the media portrayals and the increased rates of crime and some of the crimes associated with it created a public alarm about the use of crack cocaine. And so we saw that people were very compulsive with addictions to crack, and it became important to be able to recognize that violent behavior was also commonly associated with the use of crack cocaine. And again, in those areas where crack was popular, a lot of times it was already socioeconomically disadvantaged populations where there might already have been increased levels of violence, and the influx of crack cocaine and an impact on those particular populations and the violence associated. I don't know if it was largely just media portrayals of it and things that we were seeing on the nightly news as people were kind of falling into the rhythm of watching more and more of the news programs, but it really was a frenzy of public alarm. Marijuana is another controlled substance, a substance that's considered Schedule I across the United States, and federally it is illegal. In the state of California, it has been made legal for recreational uses, but marijuana has been around for a really long time. It is an intoxicant that was originally brought to Africa by Arab traders in the early 1600s. In the early 1900s, state laws against marijuana were often parts of the reaction to Mexican immigrants who had marijuana as a part of their culture as well. But because of advancements in hydroponics and hybridization, the content of the intoxicating portions of marijuana have increased significantly. So the toxicity or the potency of the THC in marijuana has gone up significantly with different hybrids. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the marijuana that was available in the 1960s was quite different from the marijuana that we have on the street today. And so the intoxicating portions of it it's much easier to become intoxicated. And I think that, all of us are impacted by marijuana in our local society. It's hard to go places, public places, without being able to smell it. Or to interact with people who are not imbibing in marijuana. But it is powerful to take a look at the historical references to marijuana that go back in federal law. In 1937, for example, there was the Marijuana Tax Act. And according to federal law, it was not considered illegal at that time. Popularity of marijuana really surfaced in the 1960s, again as part of that counterculture or drug culture and the disillusionment associated particularly with the Vietnam War. And then we saw marijuana increasing in its effectiveness of being used for a variety of medicinal conditions as well. It is a powerful appetite stimulant. It's a very good glaucoma drug that decreases intraocular pressure. It can help people who are struggling with different types of medical problems deal with some of the side effects for their medical problems. So it definitely has medicinal uses. It's just that how do we, deal with that and still keep people from overindulging to become a problem of misuse or abuse. Amphetamines are another class of drugs. Amphetamines in 1932 were marketed as an inhalant for nasal decongestion, and in small doses they weren't really a problem, but it was Benzedrine back then. By 1946 there were 39 different medicinal uses for amphetamines, but by World War II the drug was issued to soldiers to try and keep them elevated in their mood and to deal with their fatigue so that they could work longer hours or function at a higher level. But of course, as with anything that might start out with good uses, the potential for abuse was there as well. As amphetamines became more widely prescribed in the general culture, administration, the Food and Drug Administration really got involved and talked about it. It was referred to as speed at the time, and so they started a public ad campaign saying that speed kills and tried to help restrict some of the prescription uses of amphetamines. But by the 1980s, smokable amphetamines had surfaced and really took over. Crystal meth or ice. These drugs could be fabricated in home laboratories, and the crystal meth epidemic, it really ran across all of the United States and impacted huge communities and still are impacting those communities today. Crystal meth is a relatively inexpensive drug to produce, and a lot of efforts have been at trying to eliminate the tools necessary to be able to grow or to be able to laboratorily create crystal meth. For example, this is a reason why when you try to buy some cold medicine that you have to have the pharmacist take it from behind the counter, and they want to pay attention to use your driver's license to see how many of those pills you're actually buying, because it is those medications that can be used to cook methamphetamine. Barbiturates is another class of drugs that originated in Germany. These were drugs used predominantly to help people sleep, but like all the other drugs, the uses of them in pop culture, we caused a population to abuse them for different purposes. The 1960s also saw the emergence of a new category of drugs in the United States for recreational use, and that included hallucinogens. Even some people, like a Harvard psychologist professor, popularized the use of different hallucinogens as a way to elevate creativity or seek emotional or spiritual enlightenment. But LSD was made illegal in the 1960s because there was a lot of pushback against that 1960s drug culture that led to the enacting of specific legislation to limit the access to certain drugs. So how have we tried to deal with problems? How we've tried to deal with it is really dependent upon different worldviews about the best way to deal with drug problems. Some people are of the idea that individual rights and personal freedoms should allow people to decide whatever they want to decide for themselves. Other ideas say that we need to eliminate access to drugs, because by eliminating access to drugs, we will stave off these different health problems. And other people are of the idea that we should just not make the using of drugs illegal, but focus on doing things to educate people so that they won't want to use drugs. And there is really good rationale for each one of those points of view. And it really comes down to trying to understand the bigger picture and to try and look at the problem from a public health perspective. We do want to have freedom. That's part of our culture, part of what is ingrained in us as Americans. Freedom is bred into us. It is something that we hold very, very dear in our society. But safety is also something that we hold very dear, and we want to protect and keep vulnerable people in our society safe. We want our streets to be safe. We want to eliminate crime as much as possible so that people don't have to worry about crime or violence. And so the ideas about a safe and orderly society suggests that eliminating the access to drugs is beneficial for the most people. So we see a pushback across all different types of approaches to dealing with the drug problem. But if we look at how we've historically dealt with it, in the 1990s, there was a lot of push towards increasing the punishment for people that were engaged in drug crimes. And those drug crimes could be something like possession of drugs with a quantity enough that you might be selling it, or just personal use. Overcrowding of prisons and the costs of running those prisons led to lots of reforms in how the courts handled drug problems, and suggesting that people that were the end users of drugs as opposed to the drug dealers, but those people that were engaged in crimes based upon their personal use of drugs, that there needs to be ways for them to reintegrate back into society. So they need to have avenues of drug treatment and diversion programs and specialized court systems to support them to getting back to a normal life. The 21st century, we've got lots of different changes and challenges. And in 2023, we have unique challenges that we didn't have before. We have lots of concerns about non-medical uses of prescription drugs, because prescription drugs are readily available even if you don't have a prescription for them. We have lots of societal problems with crime and violence that can be associated with these drug problems. And I can't say that we have all of the answers. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about understanding the problem, and you're here to figure out how you want to form the answers for yourself. You're here to critically think based on the information that's available and to come up with your own ideas and your own opinions about the nature of the problem and possible solutions that you're going to use in your life, in your community going forward.